Hi everybody, and welcome to the third mini-lecture of the week. In early 1919, the United States was at an uneasy peace. Having just fought to end the Great War in Europe, it faced domestic discontent, exacerbated by the storm of Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Many in the American labor movement held leftist political sentiments, and many intellectuals supported socialism, communism, or anarchism. Much of the conflict between capital and labor simmered below the surface during World War I, as many workers and unions put organizing on hold during the war. There were nativist fears of recent immigrants, especially Irish, German, and Russians, that combined with the racialism of the immigration restriction movement, as we see in Defending the Master Race. This simmering subsurface strife erupted in 1919. A group of anarchists began sending bombs through the mail, targeting Wall Street, government officials, businessmen, and police chiefs, with one sent to Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. That particular bomb exploded in his front yard and did minor damage to his house, but Palmer was unscathed yet not unshaken. Palmer used the bombing to broaden the authority of the Office of the Attorney General and expand the Bureau of Investigation. He requested a larger budget and appointed a 24-year-old firebrand investigator to lead the Bureau of Investigation's General Intelligence Division, a young J. Edgar Hoover. This was effectively the predecessor to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which J. Edgar Hoover led until his death in the 1970s. Palmer and J. Edgar Hoover began targeting political dissidents. For years before, the General Intelligence Division had been keeping tabs on leftists, and it swung into action. The first raids targeted Russian immigrants and workers on the second anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And the GID and local police forces swept up hundreds in mass arrests, beating several people very badly. J. Edgar Hoover soon broadened the scope of the Palmer raids and began targeting organized labor and suspected communists. The second wave of raids brought more than 10,000 arrests, and the suspects were held in crowded, unsanitary facilities. Many of the arrests were illegal and executed without a warrant, but J. Edgar Hoover didn't really care. And the detainees were often held without trial for months, and many were beaten, starved, and tortured. Radicals, such as Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, Big Bill Haywood, and many others were deported to the newly formed USSR, packed aboard the USS Buford, which earned the nickname of the, quote, Soviet Ark. Most of the deported radicals would die in the Soviet Union. It was a gregarious violation of their civil liberties due to their political beliefs, and profoundly unconstitutional. Concerned civil libertarians and lawyers formed the American Civil Liberties Union to attempt to fight against future government overreach and repression. The Palmer raids of 1919 to 21 are largely considered by historians to mark a Red Scare in the U.S., an outbreak of anti-leftist sentiment that usually results in widespread government repression. Some historians consider the events of the early 1890s to be one of the first Red Scares, as the government and industry targeted labor organization, especially as we saw in the mines of the West. Many others look to the events of the late 1940s and early 1950s to be another Red Scare under the banner of Joe McCarthy's anti-communist crusade. The Red Scare of 1919 to 20 largely subsided as the U.S. economy improved, rising out of a short post-war depression. However, immigrants, political radicals, and dissidents were not the only groups targeted after World War I. African Americans faced escalating urban violence at the hands of white mobs, often supported by the police and National Guard. As Britain, France, and the United States hammered out terms of peace in Paris to end the Great War, returning black veterans came home to fight for freedom in the land of Jim Crow. The black intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois wrote an editorial in the NAACP's paper, The Crisis, and argued, quote, "We are returning from war. The crisis and tens of thousands of black men were drafted into a great struggle. For bleeding France and what she means and has meant and will mean to us and humanity, and against the threat of German race arrogance, we fought gladly into the last drop of blood. For America and her highest ideals, we fought in far-off hope. For the dominant Southern oligarchy entrenched in Washington, we fought in bitter resignation. For the America that represents and gloats in lynching, disenfranchisement, caste, brutality, and devilish insult. For this, and the hateful upturning and mixing of things, we were forced by a vindictive fate to fight also. But today we return. We return from the slavery of uniform, which the world's madness demanded us to don to the freedom of civil garb. We stand again to look America squarely in the face and call a spade a spade. We sing, this country of ours, despite all its better souls have done and dreamed, is yet a shameful land. It lynches. And lynching is a barbarism of a degree of contemptible nastiness unparalleled to human history. Yet for 50 years we have lynched 2 Negroes a week, and we have kept this up right through the war. It insults us. It has organized a nationwide and latterly a worldwide propaganda of deliberate and continuous insult and defamation of black blood wherever found. It decrees that it shall not be possible in travel nor residence, work nor play, education nor instruction, for a black man to exist without tacit or open acknowledgement of his inferiority to the dirtiest white dog. And it looks upon any attempted question or even discuss this dogma as arrogance, unwarranted assumption, and treason. This is the country to which we soldiers of democracy return. This is the fatherland for which we fought, but it is our fatherland. It was right for us to fight. The faults of our country are our faults. Under similar circumstances, we would fight again. But by the God of heaven, we are cowards and jackasses. If now that the war is over, we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. We return. We return from fighting. We return fighting. Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States of America, or know the reason why. End quote. As hundreds of thousands of black veterans came home from France, they returned to a segregated country. Many of these black veterans joined the Great Migration to northern and western cities, and many others chose to remain in the South. They returned with confidence and swagger. The men of the 92nd Infantry had faced down industrial warfare and fought to make the world safe for Wilson's ideals of democracy. Membership in the NAACP skyrocketed, multiplying by more than tenfold. These black veterans spoke out against racist discrimination, inequality, and violence. These black veterans returned to fight this segregation, and in the summer of 1919, white supremacist mobs attacked these black veterans, both through the lynching of black veterans, but also large-scale attacks on black communities. 1919 earned the sobriquet of Red Summer, as more than 25 urban riots broke out, with white mobs attacking black people and communities. Houston, Chicago, Omaha, East St. Louis, Charleston, Washington, D.C. Violence in each of these major cities broke out, with white mobs emboldened by, quote, the persistence of unpunished lynching to attack black communities. Black war veterans were lynched while wearing the uniform of the United States military. But black veterans also defended their communities. In Chicago during the riots, veterans of the 370th Infantry Regiment stood up to the white mobs when the state would not. They resisted the white mob for 4 days until the National Guard was deployed to the city. The overwhelming majority of the dead and wounded in Chicago were black. This was just one of many racist riots of whites attacking blacks in the summer of 1919. Perhaps the most profound incidents of racialized violence came in the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. There, a young black man was accused of assaulting a young white woman and was held in the courthouse, the standard beginning for a narrative of low lynching. A white mob gathered, and a black mob formed to stop the lynching. Several very tense hours passed as each group collected arms. Eventually, later at night, gunfire broke out and a riot erupted. However, we need to offer some context. Oklahoma did not become a state until 1907, having been a territory until that point. A place to deport the Cherokee in the 1830s. A place for black folks to get out of the Deep South. And a place with some cheap land. It gained statehood with codified Jim Crow laws in its constitution, making it an apartheid state. It also sat on a lot of oil. That black gold that was gaining prominence as the fossil fuel of choice. The expansion of the oil industry in Oklahoma was particularly beneficial to the black folks in Greenwood, as many black people made a lot of money either leasing their properties for oil development, working in, or investing in industry. Greenwood, Oklahoma gained the nickname Black Wall Street, as its oil wealth translated into a booming economy for African Americans during the short-lived post-war economic downturn. Black professionals such as doctors, lawyers, and investors lived in Greenwood and had a lot of money. There were black-owned grocery stores, movie theaters, newspapers, and nightclubs. We cannot underestimate the power of economic resentment in stirring racial animus. The black residents of Greenwood had jewelry and suits, nice houses, and automobiles. Their lives were going well. The riot escalated after the first gunshots, and white arsonists began setting fire to black businesses and residences in Greenwood. The National Guard arrived and deployed to protect white neighborhoods, while fighting between blacks and whites continued. White rioters fired indiscriminately into black crowds, and thousands of black people fled Greenwood. Groups of white looters and arsonists ravaged Greenwood, stealing anything of value that was not nailed down, and setting fires everywhere. Airplanes began flying over Greenwood, with white flyers dropping incendiary bombs and firing rifles from the sky. A recently uncovered primary document indicates that some law enforcement officers were aboard the aircraft, firing into the ground. The National Guard also rounded up black residents, gathering thousands and holding them in custody. And there are reports that the National Guard may have fired a machine gun into a crowd of black people as well. Recently, the mayor of Tulsa announced that the city would begin conducting archaeological explorations of 3 sites that may contain mass graves of the dead of the Tulsa riots. These graves have been detected with ground scanning radar, but not yet excavated. Roughly 300 black bodies disappeared during the riots, and there are no concrete numbers of dead. They were and remain the most violent race riot in American history, involving aerial firebombing, mass graves, dispossession and looting, murder, and other terrific offenses. 10,000 black people lost their homes. And for those that did not flee Tulsa, many lived through the winter of 1922 in tents as they rebuilt after their economically prosperous portion of the city had burnt. No white person was ever charged with the crime. It has been called a massacre, a pogrom, and a mass lynching. It remains one of the most profound examples of expropriative violence in 20th century American history. All right, I think that does it for this mini lecture, and I'll see you in the discussion forums.